Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is our Shadows Over Innistrad Remastered set overview. I'm treating this set like a normal draft set, seeing as it's going to be the set that we draft for the next month, and we're going to be doing a set overview like we do for most sets, and also a state of the format, and potentially a follow-up afterwards. I might have a guest or two on to talk about this set and everybody's experiences. Also, if you haven't kept up with this, there is a arena open on April 1st using this set. So if you're, anywhere in the realm of competitive minded and want to get an edge, well, it's a good place to start here. Set's coming out on the 21st, which is Tuesday. I'm recording this podcast on Saturday, so in a few days from now. So it's going to be up, like I said, for a month. Today, on our set overview, like we usually do, I'm going to be touching on the set's themes, mechanics, archetypes, the bonus sheets that there's like a kind of Strixhaven Mystical Archive / Brothers War Retro Artifact sheet, a bonus sheet kind of in that vein. I'm going to be touching on that. And of course, some notable commons. One thing to note about this set overview compared to a set overview that I might do for another set is that I've played with every single card in this set already. I played a lot of Shadows Over Innistrad block when the set first came out. So I do have a pretty good idea of how the cards are going to play out. Also, some notable differences. There's been rarity shifts. There's a few added cards. So it's not going to play out exactly the same, but I do think I have a lot to say about the cards that I know how they function and how they play out. So that's what we have on the docket today. Before we jump into that, of course, got to shout out that Patreon. Patreon.com/Limited Level Ups. This is a place you can go if you want to support the show, if you like what we're doing here. We got a very active Discord as well if you want to join the fun. That's bit.ly/join the Discord. Discord spelled with a CH like Corticals. Bunch of really, really smart people over there that you can engage in some conversation with about Limited. Either about a new set, one of the best times to join is, we have this new set coming, or just, there's people over there that will look over your draft logs, look over your gameplay logs very happily. A lot of really like-minded people. If you're listening to this podcast, I imagine they're like-minded to you. Everybody over there is looking to get better at their game and help you along the way. So check that out. That is a free Discord. There's also a bunch of benefits tied to the Patreon. With that Discord, you get access to me at certain tiers to do deck techs and draft log reviews, that kind of stuff. So if you are looking to take your game to the next level, go check that out. Patreon.com/Limited Level Ups. All right, so a quick overview of what's happening with this set, Shadows Over Innistrad Remastered, before we dive into the meat of it. So this is a remaster, just like they did with Amonkhet Remastered and Kaladesh Remastered, of the Shadows Over Innistrad block, which includes Shadows Over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon. And there's roughly about half the cards from this set coming from each of their respective sets. They kind of just match them together. This is the block that came out in 2016, so it's not the original one with like Snapcaster, Liliana, Spider Spawning that. But, like I mentioned a second ago, there is a bonus sheet. So, while most of the cards, 90% of them are from Shadows Over Innistrad block, there's also a bonus sheet, kind of like that Strixhaven Mystical Archive slot, like the Brothers War Retro Artifact sheet, where there's a designated slot, one card in every pack of what they're calling the Shadows of the Past cards. And these are cards from original Innistrad. I'm going to get into the specifics of this and exactly how it's going to work a little bit later, but just know there are cards from original Innistrad in this set, one per pack. Some of them are rare, some of them are uncommon, some of them are common. Just they span all rarities. If you haven't played a Innistrad set before, the main themes that, big picture, all the archetypes are going to fall into one of these two main themes. That is either the graveyard or tribal creature type matter stuff, right? So there's a lot of, in previous Innistrad sets and in Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, there was some stuff going on with the graveyard, flashback, disturb, reasons you wanted to fill up your graveyard. That's all kind of here as well. And of course, like any other Innistrad set, there is the very heavy tribal theme focusing on the 5 main creature types you're going to find on Innistrad, which is humans, zombies, werewolves, spirits, and vampires. And of course, we're going to get into all of that when we touch on the archetypes. Another big thing about this set, I noted this when I was introing the set, but there are about 40 rarity shifts. So going from uncommon to commons, sometimes in some cases, rares got downshifted to uncommon. There's a card here, Imprisoned in the Moon, which is 2 and a blue for a common, used to be a rare. It's an aura that you enchant a creature, land, or planeswalker, and that the enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap, add a colorless mana, and it adds loses all other abilities. That creature loses all other abilities. That was a rare back in the day. They've shifted that down to common to give blue like an okay removal spell, and they've done a lot of stuff like that. They've kind of really distilled and refined all the archetypes. So, like, for example, the Black-Red Madness deck, that was often kind of uncommon dependent. They shifted a lot of the important cards down to common. They did a lot of that in other places too, where you basically just get to have your deck do the thing a little more often because you'll see the cards that are important at common. And now, this isn't all that important for people who haven't played this set before. You know, this is your first time interacting with this set. The rarities are what they are. But I do think it's relevant for those of us who have maybe been exposed to this before. You may be tempted to use your previous experiences as a baseline for how this set's going to play out. And while I don't think it's bad to use those experiences as a baseline, I do think that the set is going to feel enough different, especially because there are a few notable decks that these rarity shifts really affect, like I noted, black-red. It's going to feel different, and some of the archetypes that were strong are going to get a little bit better, and vice versa. Some of the archetypes that maybe were some of the better archetypes, I think, lost some stuff along the way. Blue-green Emerge is one of the ones that was really one of the better decks back in Eldritch Moon. It's not really that much of a deck here. There are Emerge cards, but they took out some of them. They, they're just not all here. So just something to think about. Okay, so let's get into our mechanics here. So the first mechanic here is Delirium. And like I said, this is a Graveyard Matters set. This is the main Graveyard Matters mechanic. This is the reason why you're going to want to self-mill, want to put stuff in the graveyard. And the idea with Delirium is it's on almost exclusively creatures. I think there's maybe one or two non-creatures. But this is a version of I get better as the game goes on. So Delirium says, my creature gets a bonus when I have 4 different card types in my graveyard. That is going to happen over the course of the game naturally. You know, just creatures are going to go to your grave, instant sorceries are going to go to your grave, but you can definitely also like turbo out Delirium in some decks where you have a lot of self-mill, you have cards that enable this quicker than you might in just some other decks. Like, but mostly this is a black-green mechanic, and black-green is a little bit grindy. It's going to want to put stuff in its graveyard. It's going to want to self-mill. It's going to want to sacrifice things for value. But it also appears in all the colors to some degree. Like, there's some red cards, some white cards, some blue cards. In decks that aren't turboing out getting to 4 card types in the graveyard, it's kind of just going to be incidental. Maybe you're going to make a play where it's like, oh, okay, like I can sacrifice a land here. I get that land in the graveyard that turns on Delirium. Just because you have a Delirium card in your deck doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be all in, like, enabling it. Like I said, it's kind of just like, the classic story with Tarmogoyf is that, like, when Tarmogoyf first came out, it was like, well, how much work are we going to have to do to turn this on to make it a 4/5? And the answer is Magic games just kind of play out in a way where creatures go to the grave, stuff goes to the grave, they eventually turn on. But like I said, if you are really a heavy Delirium deck, and Black-Green is the Delirium deck, you can put some cards in your deck to specifically enable this. So, number 1, cards that self-mill are quite strong here. 2 cards of note. Crow of Dark Tidings, which is 2 and a black for a 2/1 flyer. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you mill 2 cards. Grapple with the Past, 1 and a green instant. Mill 3 cards, then return a creature or a land from your graveyard to your hand. And one of the best enablers, they actually upshifted this to uncommon. They didn't do many upshifts, but this is one of them. Vessel of Nascency, single green mana for enchantment at uncommon. 1 and a green, sacrifice the vessel, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You can put an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker from among them into your hand, the rest in the graveyard. The reason this is so good is not only does it dump 4 cards into the graveyard, but it dumps this card itself, which is an enchantment, which brings me to my next point, that when you do have a Delirium heavy deck, you're often going to want to prioritize different card types, because the card types I mentioned, creatures, instant sorceries, those are going in your deck most of the time in most limited decks. But you do sometimes reach out into having an enchantment, having some artifacts. Deadweight is a really good enchantment. This is a single black mana for an aura. Enchanted creature gets -2/-2, so it's basically a removal spell. But since when you kill a 2/2 with this thing, this goes to the graveyard, and enchantment goes to the graveyard. Another thing that's really valuable is cards with multiple card types. So there are artifact creatures, like there is in most sets in this set. Something like Wildfield Scarecrow. This is 3 mana for a 1/4. It's an artifact creature. Has Defender, and you can sacrifice the Scarecrow to search your library for 2 basic lands, put them into your hand. So this is a card that sits there, kind of blocks for a while, then gets 2 card types in your graveyard. There's also cards like Angelic Purge, 2 and a white sorcery. As an additional cost to casting the spell, sacrifice a permanent, then you exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment. There are a few cards like this that ask you to sacrifice an additional permanent when you cast it. And often what you can do is, sometimes you'll sack a creature, just like a Bone Splinters effect, but a lot of times you'll just sacrifice a land. Not only is, your 6th land not going to be that valuable most of the time, but it gets that land in the graveyard. And land is a tricky type to get into the graveyard. This isn't like Constructed where we're playing with fetch lands. There's not even an Evolving Wilds in the set unless you count the one. There is one on the bonus sheet, but that's only on certain weeks of the bonus sheet. So it's not that easy to get lands in the graveyard. Enchantments are, not going to the graveyard that commonly. So really, really outside of creature, sorcery, instant, you're looking to artifacts, ways to get your lands in the graveyard, and these enchantments as well. So just something to keep in mind when you're building around Delirium. Like I said, it's not going to be a all-in thing all that often. It's mostly going to be just incidental. You have some Delirium cards in your deck. All right, the next mechanic here is Madness. And this is a pretty big one. So Madness is a mechanic that's on all card types, sorceries, instants, creatures. And it says, if you were to discard this card, you can instead cast it for the Madness cost on the card. So for example, we have the card here, Giss's Bidding, 2 black for a common sorcery. You make 2 black zombie creature tokens, so pretty good. 4 mana, make 2 tokens. Madness, 2 and a black. So this mechanic might seem a little bit strange if you haven't played it with it before, because I think the benefits of this mechanic aren't super obvious, but there's 3 main reasons why Madness is powerful. So 1, cost reduction. Most of the Madness cards, their Madness cost will be cheaper than their normal full retail cost. So Alchemist Greeting is a good example. 5 mana for a sorcery, 4 in red, deals 4 damage to target creature, but if you cast it for its Madness cost, it's only 2 mana. So that's a huge discount. Giss's Bidding, like I just read, goes from 4 mana to 3 mana. There are some cards that keep their cost. Something like Insatiable Gorgers, which is a 4 mana, 5/3, attacks each turn if able. It's got Madness for 3 in a red. So there are some examples where it's not always going to reduce the cost, but in most cases, you're getting a cost reduction when you go through the trouble of, I discarded this card and I'm going to cast it. The second thing is to help pay for costs, right? These Madness cards are pretty good when you're paying for costs that ask you to discard a card. So something like Tormenting Voice, which of course, 1 in a red for a sorcery, as an additional cost to cast this card, you discard a card, draw 2 cards. This is a card that in this set's context is kind of nice when you pair it with something like a Giss's Bidding or a Fiery Temper, which is a Madness burn spell, being able to discard that. Because the thing is, with Tormenting Voice generally, it's card neutral, right? You discard a card, you draw 2 cards, you use Tormenting Voice, you're not actually going up a card. But when you discard a Madness card, you actually are going up a card here, right? You're discarding your Madness card, that card gets cast, and then you draw 2 cards as well. So something to note there. And also something like Olivia's Dragoons, which is a 2 mana 2/2 in black. It's got the ability to discard a card. Olivia's Dragoons gains flying until end of turn. So, in a normal set, if this was just thrown in, it wouldn't be that good of a card, because discarding a card just to get flying is not a very good ability. But to enable your Madness cards, it is something that you're going to want in your decks. Third thing, the third benefit of Madness, and this is the really unintuitive thing, but when you cast a card for its Madness cost, it is a instant speed card. So, Giss's Bidding, that card I was talking about, the Zombie Maker, you can cast that for 2 and a black if you can discard it at instant speed and flash that in. Creatures with Madness, they have flash. Something like Stensia Masquerade, which is a uncommon enchantment, 2 and a red for a enchantment at uncommon. It says attacking creatures you control have first strike. Whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Madness, 2 and a red. So just being able to flash this in, flashing in this enchantment during combat can be a pretty big blowout. So often the way the Madness deck plays out is it plays an early enabler, an early discard outlet, something like that Olivia's Dragoons that I just talked about, the 2/2 that can gain flying, or a notable downshift in rarity here, Ravenous Bloodseeker, 1 in a red for a 1/3. This is a common, used to be an uncommon. Discard a card, Ravenous Bloodseeker gets +2, -2 until end of turn. And when your opponent plays one of these on turn 2, the entire rest of the game, they can just go, all right, pass the turn. And then what are you going to do, right? If you leave 3 mana up, you've got a 2/2. It's such a disaster if they just flash in Giss's Bidding, right? They just discard to their Olivia's Dragoon on your turn. They flash in Bidding for 3 mana. They block your 2/2. They're left with the 2/2. Normally, if they just play that sorcery speed, you're just not going to attack your 2/2 into their 2/2 token very often. But, it's so hard to play around a deck with one of these enablers on the battlefield. And so when you're looking for how to build your Madness decks, you generally want a mix of Madness enablers and Madness spells at about a 1-to-1 ratio, like the discard outlets and the Madness cards. The ones I just mentioned, Ravenous Bloodseeker and Olivia's Dragoons, those are some of the best ones. Another one that's kind of sneaky good, doesn't look that good, is Insolent Neonate. So this is a single red mana for a 1/1 menace. You can sacrifice it to discard a card, draw a card, so another instant speed outlet. Mad Prophet, this is a big one too. 4 mana for a 2/2 haste, 3 in a red, add uncommon. Discard a card, draw a card. So if your deck is just full of Madness cards, You just get to get, I was talking about Tormenting Voice, how that counts as well. You get to actually get card advantage with that if you discard a Madness card. If your deck has like 7 Madness cards in it, you're just drawing a card off Mad Prophet every single turn and getting a mana advantage and being able to cast your cards with Flash. So just note, anything that discards a card as a cost is probably a little bit better than you might think because of all these Madness cards. The next mechanic here is we're getting into the kind of lesser mechanics or lesser represented mechanics. We have Emerge here. So this is a mechanic that was only in Eldritch Moon, only in the second set. And Emerge says you can cast this card for its Emerge cost if you sacrifice a creature, and when you do, the Emerge cost is reduced by whatever you sacrifice mana value. So for example here, we've got Wretched Griff. This is a common. All of these Emerge cards are expensive, non-colored creatures. They're all colorless creatures. They're like Eldrazi's. They're all 7 mana, 8 mana, 9 mana. Often you're going to cast them for their Emerge cost, which then add a color. So example, Wretched Griff here, 7 mana, colorless, 3/4 flyer. When you cast a spell, you draw a card, but it's got an Emerge cost for 5 and a blue. So say you sacrifice a 3-drop, and often that 3-drop might have generated value for you somehow, drawn a card, or when it dies, it draws a card, so you don't feel too bad sacrificing it. Then on turn 4, you cast Wretched Griff, you sacrifice your 3-drop, you get a 3 mana, 3/4 flyer that's drawn a card. And most of the time, with these Emerge cards, they do give you some sort of value when you cast them. So if you do need to sacrifice something that didn't give you value, you just sacrifice a 3-drop, you still draw a card, or you still get to, in the case of Mockery of Nature here, which is a 9 mana 6/5, when you cast this for its Emerge cost, which is 7 and a green, you can destroy an artifact or enchantment. So often they will give you value even if you don't sacrifice something good, but if you do have something like an Exultant Cultist, which is 3 mana 2/2, 2 and a blue for a 2/2, when it dies you draw a card, or Drownyard Explorers, which is 3 and a blue for a 2/4, when it enters the battlefield you investigate, which means you make a clue. If you can sacrifice one of these and get the additional effect, like on the Griff you also draw another card, that's something that's nice to set up. So I don't think this is going to be a deck. Like, there's just not enough Emerge cards. They've even cut the best Emerge card, Lashweed Lurker, which was like it was a blue-green gold card that like put something when it enters the battlefield, you put one of your opponent's creatures on top of their library, which was just like such a sicko. It was like a 5/4. It was pretty big too. There's not enough Emerge cards to make it a full deck, but in a deck just with a bunch of fodder, a few things you like sacrificing, they're pretty good cards, especially the Wretched Griff. This is a premium card. This is one of Blue's better commons. You're happy with Wretched Griff even if you don't have the enablers, but if you do have the enablers I just talked about, it gets even better. Speaking of which, we got Investigate. So Investigate, or Clues, most people know this mechanic. This is the set that it first debuted in. For those who don't know, when you investigate, you make a clue, which is a token, an artifact token that has 2, tap it, sacrifice it, draw a card. So this is just a nice little way to get some cards flowing, or just make it so you don't flood very often. Some of the better ones, Thraben Inspector. This is one of another card that I think people are going to know. This is 1 mana for a 1/2 at common. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, just one of White's best commons. Byway Courier is another pretty solid one, 2 and a green for a 3/2. When it dies, you investigate. There's also a few cards that call out investigating or sacrificing clues. Graph Mole is one, 2 and a green for an uncommon 2/4. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you gain 3 life. Ordwall Illuminator, 1 and a blue for a 1/3 flyer at uncommon. Whenever you investigate for the first time each turn, you investigate an additional time. So there are a few things that call this out, but generally it's just like gravy on most of your cards. Like anything that says investigate is going to be a good card. There are very few exceptions, maybe 1 or 2 in there, but you can just, as far as if this is your first time going through the set and you're just trying to parse which of the cards are good, almost all the cards that just say investigate or make a clue, you can be pretty safe to say that it's going to be a card you want in your deck. Skulk. This is kind of a weird one. So Skulk was an experiment, a bit of a failed experiment on WotC's part. So they were trying to find a mechanic that both blue and black could use at common. A tool at common that you could get like, hey, for example, green and red, they have a shared mechanic in trample. Blue and white, they have a shared mechanic in flying. And blue and black didn't really have a shared mechanic, and they kind of want one for each color pair, and Skulk was their experiment. They have since replaced this. They've realized that Flash is a decent replacement, so that's now the blue-black main thing that you do at common. But Skulk was this kind of weird evasion ability. So what Skulk says is, this creature can't be blocked by creatures with greater power than it. For example, we've got Fogwalker. 1 and a blue for a 1/3 Skulk. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So it's not very complex. I just thought I would note it. It can be a little strange because your opponent has a 3/3, you've got a 1/3. Your brain sometimes tells you, or doesn't tell you, oh, I have an attack here, but then you realize, oh, my creature has Skulk, and that actually does attack past the 3/3. So it's actually a bit unintuitive when you first play with it. I remember first playing with it, and that exact situation I just described, where the opponent's board looks big, so your brain goes, oh, I probably don't have an attack here. So just note, like I said, there's not very many cards with Skulk in the set, but just note that it's just a fine evasive mechanic. It's never downside, but it's also never like an amazing thing. Okay, so those are the mechanics. Let's move into some archetypes here. So I'm going to cover most of the archetypes. There's one or two archetypes that are kind of loose, kind of don't have that definition. I'm going to point them out, but I'm not going to go in depth. Maybe next week, once we kind of figure out what the better archetypes are, I'll go in a little more depth. I can't imagine that the unsupported or lesser supported archetypes are going to be the better ones, but, never know. So I am going to start with the 5 creature type matters archetypes. These are the allied color pairs. So white-green humans, blue-white spirits, blue-black zombies, red-black vampires, and green-red werewolves. The first one I want to start with is white-green humans. So this is a pretty typical low-to-the-ground aggro deck. There's nothing too fancy going on here. The signpost in common is Veteran Cathar. This is 1 and a green for a 2/2, and it has an activated ability 3 and a white. Target human gains double strike until end of turn. And worth noting that the signpost uncommons in the set are a little bit weird because half of them are actual gold cards, like a red-white gold card, a blue-red gold card, and half of them are like Veteran Cathar here, where they're a monocolored card with a off-color activation. They did this because the original Shadow set didn't actually have gold uncommon cards, only Eldritch Moon did, and, if they wanted to take the uncommon from Eldritch Moon, it was gold. If they want to take the uncommon from Shadows, it was one of these. So just a little bit strange. If you're looking through the set and you're wondering where all the gold cards are, that's where they are. They're just hidden in amongst the monocolored cards. As far as cards you want for this deck, for green-white humans, I mean, it's just humans for the most part. Like, there are quite a few cards that call out humans that are really powerful. This is one of the decks out of all the tribal decks that I actually care if my card is a human. Like, vampires, zombies, werewolves, there are cards that call out, oh, your werewolves get +1/+1, or your zombies gain death touch, or whatever. But there are more payoffs, maybe not more payoffs, but better payoffs for the humans, I believe, than any other of the color pairs. So look for the cheap humans. Some of the standouts here: Thraben Inspector, single white mana for the 1/2, ETBs Investigates. Dauntless Cathar, 2 and a white for a 3/2. You can exile it from your graveyard by paying 1 and a white to make a 1/1 spirit token. Sigardian Priest, 1 and a white for a 1/2. 1 tap target non-human creature. From green, you get Byway Courier, which is the 3 mana 3/2 that when it dies investigates, and Obsessive Skinner. This is a new addition, at least at common, because this wasn't uncommon. So this is 1 and a white for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and Delirium, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you've got Delirium, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So nice little aggressive creature that has relevance throughout as the game goes on. One of the things that's interesting about this deck is that, unlike a lot of green-white creature decks in most formats, you actually have the ability to grind pretty well through Investigate and through clues. Like, you have access to card draw, where green-white generally doesn't have that, as well as you have some access to some pretty good augmentations in True Faith Censor and Griff Spoon. So True Faith Censor is a 2 mana equipment. The equipped creature has +1/+1 and Vigilance, and as long as the equipped creature is a human, it's an additional +1/+0. The equip cost is 2. This is a really effective equipment in your human decks. You don't really want it in your non-human decks, because +2/+1 in Vigilance is a lot more than +1/+1 in Vigilance. But 2 mana, 2 to equip, +2/+1 Vigilance. That turns most things into a threat. And then another really great one, like I mentioned, is Griff's Boon. This is an uncommon single white mana for an aura. The enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has flying. 4 mana ability, you can pay from your graveyard, return Griff's Boon to the battlefield, attached to target creature, activate it as a sorcery. So just eventually all your creatures gain flying, right? Just like you put it on your 3-drop, send it in, they kill it, it goes to the graveyard. The boon goes to the graveyard, you buy it back eventually. So really, really good ways to push damage. Like I mentioned, there are pretty good payoffs. Hamlet Captain, 1 and a green for an uncommon 2/2. When it attacks or blocks, other humans you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Courageous Outrider is a 4 mana 3/4 in white. At uncommon, when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can reveal a human from them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. So really a large incentive to play a lot of humans in your deck. And then a kind of I don't want to call it weird because I don't think it's that weird, and especially in today's world of 1-drops being awesome, I think people are going to pick up on this card being good more than they did back in 2016. But Town Gossip Monger is an uncommon 1 white mana for a 1/1. You can tap it and tap an untapped creature you control to transform it, and the backside transforms into a 2/3, attacks each turn if able, but has an ability 2 mana. You can pump it, give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So just really, really nice 1-drop. I remember this card being pretty underrated just because people, they definitely disregarded 1-drops in 2016. And this is one of the better ones that you'll find in the set. Next up, we've got Green-Red Werewolves. So this iteration of Green-Red Werewolves is definitely better than the Midnight Hunt Werewolves. A lot of the werewolves just are more powerful. There's definitely some weird wrinkles to get into. But our signpost uncommon is Tuna Red for a 3/2. This is Ulrich's Kindred. It's got Trample, so 3 mana, 3/2 Trample, and it's got an activated ability, 3 and a green, target attacking wolf or werewolf gains indestructible end of turn. So really, it's not amazing. It's about as good as the last signpost uncommon, the 2/2 that gives double strikes to humans. It's not like blow you out of the water, but it's definitely a pain, right? Just like this comes down, you attack next turn. You've got Threat of Activation for making one of your things indestructible. So a solid card for sure. One of the things that is a huge, huge departure from the Midnight Hunt Werewolves is there is no Day-Night. Day-Night was a brand new thing to Midnight Hunt, and instead we got like the original werewolf mechanic, which was basically like a proto Day-Night. It was very similar, but the Day-Night like emblem thing doesn't get introduced. Basically, all of the older werewolves, they have the text at the beginning of each upkeep. If no spells were cast this turn, transform it, and it just transforms to the backside. The two differences between these kind of werewolves and the Midnight Hunt werewolves, the Day-Night ones, are 1, this counts your opponent's spells as well. So if you pass the turn hoping to flip your werewolves and they cast an instant, your werewolves aren't going to flip. So that's something to note. And 2, your werewolves never enter on their backside, right? They're always going to enter on their front. Because Day-Night's not a thing, the game doesn't track that. There's no way to have them enter on their back. There's also the Eldritch Moon werewolves. They kind of did a twist on them where they don't have that mechanic of, at the beginning of the upkeep, if no spells were cast. They just have a mana activation to transform them to the backside. So, for example, Conduit of Storms, Tuna Red for a 2/3. Whenever Conduit of Storms attacks, you add a red at the beginning of your next main phase this turn. And then it's got a 5 mana activated ability, 3 red, transform the Conduit. So you just transform to a bigger side on the backside. This plays pretty nicely with the other werewolves because it gives you something to do with the mana, right? With your mana that isn't casting a spell. Also, something worth noting that I think this set did a pretty good job of giving you things to do with your mana that weren't just casting spells. There's a decent number of flash things in the set. Something like Hellpack Resurgence, which is 2 and a green for a uncommon enchantment. It's got flash. Each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf gets +1/+1 in trample. Pack Guardian, which is one of the better uncommons, 2 green for a 4/3 flash. When it enters the battlefield, you can discard a land card, and if you do, you make a 2/2 green wolf token. Like I mentioned, those Eldritch Moon werewolves all have activated abilities, so there's stuff to do with your mana that isn't casting spells. It's kind of funny. I said that this werewolf deck is better than the Midnight Hunt deck, and it sounds like it's worse, right? Because the Midnight Hunt werewolves did flip much easier than these ones did. But I do think the inclusion of more things to do with your mana on your opponent's turn, more things that have flash, but also just better cards. Like the werewolves in this set are better than, what do we got? We got like Burdenmire, 1/4 reach, and like the 5 mana 4/3 haste uncommon. Like they really did not push the werewolves in Midnight Hunt. And I think they were a little bit afraid of how good Night Day was going to be compared to this original proto Night Day. I think they undershot a little bit. And the werewolves in this set, almost all of them are just good cards. So something like Elvenwold Captive, 1 and a green for a 1/2 defender. It adds green mana, tap to add green mana. 7 mana activated ability, 5 green, transform it, becomes a 4/6. Of course, you can use the mana from the Elvenwold Captive itself to transform it. So on turn 6, you've got a 4/6 blocker, which is kind of nice. There's also a few downshifts from rare. So they actually brought some of the rares down to uncommon. Gyre Reach Bandit is one of them. 3 and a red for a 3/2 haste uncommon. But the backside is whenever a werewolf enters the battlefield under your control, you can transform it. So nice little werewolf lord. Werewolves also get a really nice common removal spell that nobody else is going to want. Moonlight Hunt, 1 and a green for an instant at common. Choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control that's a wolf or a werewolf deals damage to its power to that creature. So nice little buff there. This was originally an uncommon as well. Again, you're going to get this card late if nobody else is a werewolf, and it is a really powerful spell. It's almost like a megabyte spell, right? Because you can team up all your wolves on one thing. It also means that if you've got multiple wolves, this can't be blown out like a normal fight spell can. They can't kill your werewolf in response because you're not targeting any of your werewolves. I mean, if you have only one, of course they can, but most of the time this is going to kill whatever you want it to kill, even if they have interaction. One card I do want to call out, and it's as good a time as any because this is a werewolf. Duskwatch Recruiter. This is one of the best uncommons. I think it was the best uncommon in Shadow Over Innistrad. This was like the mythic uncommon. So this is 1 and a green for a 2/2. So it's just a bear. It's got a 3 mana activated ability, 2 and a green. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can reveal a creature card from among them, put into your hand, and then of course it's got the werewolf text. The backside it turns into a 3/3 that has your makes your creatures cost 1 less to cast. So this is a must kill on site. You got to kill this thing or else it takes over the game. Just draws infinite cards and makes all your things cheaper. And it's also just like a really good top deck in the late game, right? You draw this on turn 7, you activate it right away. Your opponent, if the board's been stalled out, they might not even have a removal spell at this point, and this thing just takes over. So just worth noting, Duskwatch Recruiter is the absolute truth. The card's awesome. All right, next deck on the docket here is Black-Red Vampire Madness. So this is mostly a Madness deck, less so a tribal vampire deck. There's definitely some cards that call it the tribal aspect of these cards, but it's not the main thing here. We've got the Signpost in common, Olivia's Bloodswarm, 1 and a black for a 2/1 flyer that can't block. It's got a activated ability, single red mana, target vampire gains haste until end of turn. Like I mentioned, this is basically a Madness deck first and foremost. The best common enablers are the ones I called out before. Ravenous Bloodseeker, the 1 red 1/3 that you can discard a card to give itself +2, -2, so it becomes a 3/1. Olivia's Dragoons, the 1 and a black 2/2 that you can discard a card to give the Dragoons flying. And Insolent Neonate, the single red mana 1/1 menace. Discard a card, sacrifice Insolent Neonate, draw a card. Insolent Neonate, it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around what exactly this card does, but basically just think of it as a 1 mana 1/1 menace, so it's going to get in for a few points if you cast it on turn 1, and then at some point when you have a Madness card, it generates mana for you, right? Because, like I mentioned, the Madness cards are all generally going to be cheaper when you can Madness them rather than cast them, so say you have an Alchemist Greeting, for example, which is the 5 mana red removal spell. If you can cast it for its Madness cost, then by sacrificing the Neonate, you're not down a card because you're discarding it, you're drawing a new card, and it's generated 3 mana to cast the Greeting. So, like I said, one of the better enablers. And then, of course, you're just looking for the other side of the equation here, the Madness cards. Giss's Bidding, which is the token maker I called out. Alchemist Greeting, the removal spell. Again, we've got a nice downshift here. This was a rare, now an uncommon. Stormkirk Occultist. This is 2 and a red for a 3/2 trample. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You can cast it until end of turn. And it's got a Madness cost for 1 and a red. So it's not too hard to piece together the pieces for this deck. Like I said, you wanted about a 1-to-1 ratio of discard outlets and Madness cards. Some of the better outlets for discard are Mad Prophet, which is the 4 mana 2/2 haste. Discard tap, discard a card, draw a card. Lightning Axe, single red mana for a uncommon instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you either pay 5 mana, so it's either 6 mana, or you discard a card. Lightning Axe deals 5 damage to target creature. So just imagine this, right? On turn 4, you've got Lightning Axe and you've got Giss's Bidding in hand, the token maker. You pass the turn, you kill their biggest thing with Lightning Axe, you discard Giss's Bidding, you make 2 tokens, right? That's a pretty nice sequence. And I alluded to this before, but I do think that this deck in particular got a huge boost because, well, number one, a lot of the key cards are here. They didn't take out many of the key cards for this deck. And 2, those downshifts really do matter. Another kind of cool and not necessarily hidden discard outlet, but one that you might not think of, one that doesn't look quite like the other ones I just mentioned, is Haunted Dead. This is 3 and a black for a 2/2 at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 spirit token with flying, and it's got the ability 1 and a black, discard 2 cards, return Haunted Dead from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. So it comes back. Usually, you're going to just be discarding lands to this in the late game. But, of course, if you have a Madness card, you get that without having to actually discard, quote-unquote, 2 cards. Or you actually, maybe discard a land and a Madness card, and you can bring this back. And a 2/2 that makes a 1/1 flyer is a pretty good card. The one card I want to call out here that is, again, kind of weird looking, but a pretty good card is called the Bloodline. So this is 1 and a black for an enchantment at uncommon. It's got an activated ability. 1, discard a card. create a 1/1 black vampire knight creature token with lifelink, activate only once per turn. So if you've got enough Madness cards, this just enables all of them while making 1/1 lifelinkers, which, you know, those are real bodies, especially if you can augment them in any way. And it says once per turn, but it doesn't say sorcery speed, so it is an instant speed Madness outlet, and it also doesn't say on just your turn. So you can do it on your turn and your opponent's turn, either enabling your Madness cards or just turning your lands into 1/1 lifelinkers, which is a pretty good deal. And then, like I said, there is a few tribal things that vampires call out. Stensia Masquerade, I mentioned this one before, but I'll read it again. 2 and a red for an enchantment uncommon. Attacking creatures you control at first strike, and then whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, you put a counter on it, +1/+1 counter. Madness for 2 and a red. And Indulgent Aristocrat, this is a nice one, especially with Call of the Bloodline, the token maker I just called out. So it's a single black mana for a 1/1 lifelink at uncommon. 2, sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So eventually, you know, the board stalls out, you sack your worst vampire, you grow your vampires, especially with Call of the Bloodline. It's really, really nice. You can get 3/3/4/4 lifelinkers. So both these cards are quite solid, even though, you know, like I said, there's not that many good vampire payoffs. The ones that are good, and yeah, you should put these in your deck. Next up is Blue-White Spirits. So this is another deck that doesn't have a ton of mechanical definition, not a ton of cards that really care about spirits. The signpost uncommon here is Spectral Shepherd. 2 and a white for a 2/2 flyer. It's got an ability, 1 and a blue, return target spirit you control to its owner's hand. So you get a Windrake, 3 mana 2/2 flyer with an ability to protect your spirits, which, you know, it comes up. It's not a bad card. Means that all your opponent's removal spells are awkward because they have to time them in a way that you have shields down. You might get to a point in the game where you never don't leave mana up and your opponent's removal spells are all blank. So, you know, a serviceable card, not a super exciting one. And you should generally just build your blue-white decks as kind of like blue-white flyer deck, the classic limited blue-white flyer style. Go up to the ground, have some interaction, have some bounce spells, have some white removal, have some flyers to close out the game. The little quirk about this version of blue-white flyers is that you do have some elements of playing your deck at instant speed. Some of the spirits have flash, such as Drogskull Shieldmate, which is 2 and a white for a 2/3 flash at common. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +0/+1 until end of turn. And Nebelgast Herald, 2 and a blue for a uncommon 2/1 flash flyer. When it or another spirit enters the battlefield under your control, you can tap target creature your opponent controls. So the more instant speed stuff you have, the more you can play at instant speed. You know, talking about this deck and also Madness and the werewolves which have flash, there's a lot of things that are going to be happening at instant speed in this set, which is kind of actually a knock against the werewolves deck now that I think about it, because the red-black deck that I was just talking about, that deck was good back in the day, but definitely relied on some uncommons. And now that some of the uncommons got shifted down, or some of the rares got shifted down to uncommon, you're going to have things playing out at instant speed a little more often. And especially, like I said, there are some flash cards in blue-white too. So yeah, that actually might make the werewolves a little bit worse than they were before. And just kind of like using my own advice of don't use your baselines as, you know, the truth for going to this new set where rarities are a bit different. It might mean that all of the werewolves just get a bit worse. Anyways, back to Blue-White Spirits. Yeah, there's not a lot of complexity with what's going on here. I did want to note Drogskull Shieldmate as a common, not an uncommon. So this is the 2/3 flash that when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +0/+1 until end of turn. This is really odd. One of the things they do when they're designing commons is they when somebody designs a common, they'll show it to other people at R&D, and they have like these red flags that they'll post on these cards, or note that, hey, this card is like might be too good at common, or might have some play pattern issues at common, and they generally shy away from cheap flash creatures at common that can eat your opponent's creatures in the early game. Like, your opponent plays a 2/2, and you're in white, and you pass the turn on turn 3 with this in your hand. What's your opponent going to do? Are they just going to attack in their 2/2? Okay, well, this eats it because it's a 2/3 flash. And if they don't attack, well, you know, you can just flash it anyway. They've kind of wasted their attack step, but they don't get any attack for that turn because the implicit risk of that, right? So I don't know exactly if this is going to pan out as a really notable important common, because as people play around it, it's not going to be as brutal. But just, it did raise a bit of a red flag in my mind as, okay, that's something that they don't usually do at common. I wonder if this was, because this is not a set that the entire design team worked on, I wonder if this kind of slipped through the cracks because, like I said, not something you usually get access to. So just something to keep an eye out for, and especially as you're playing against a blue-white deck. All right, and our last tribal deck is blue-black zombies. So unlike Midnight Hunt, where it was the scourge of the format, there's really not a lot of mechanical definition going on here. You thought Spirits was light on mechanical definition? Blue-black is even less focused and doesn't really have a true theme. So kind of the idea is you've got expendable bodies that you can sacrifice in some way. And the problem with that is, one, the expendable bodies aren't in excess, and there's also not that many ways to expend them. So, like, you've got the Signpost in common here, Druno Corpse Trawler, which is 3 and a blue for a 1/1 at uncommon. It enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 black zombie token, and it's got the ability 2 and a black, target zombie gains death touch until end of turn. Not a super exciting card, just not a great card in general. It's a fine one, but nothing to be excited for. So that's like part of the foddery, something you could point to and be like, yeah, this generates multiple bodies. There's also the Exultant Cultist, like I mentioned, which is a human wizard. It's a 2 and a blue for a 2/2. When it dies, you draw a card. I think generally what you're going to be doing in blue-black is reaching into the other mechanics of the set. For example, it's a decent place for the emerge creatures. If you can sack your Corpse Trawler to a Wretched Gryph, that's not bad. You get to cast a 3 mana Wretched Gryph, which is, by the way, again, reading this out, 7 mana, 3/4 flyer with emerge for 5 and a blue. When you cast the spell, you draw a card. So that's something you can do with kind of the tokens you make. Although it's kind of funny because whenever you have something expendable, like often when you think of expendable creatures and sacrificing them, you think about tokens. But the emerge creatures don't work very well with tokens. You do get a mana discount. For example, Wretched Gryph is 7 colorless mana, but 6 if you cast for blue. But you really do want to be casting these for like 3 or 4 mana if you can. So a little bit awkward there. There's also some spots where Madness can come into play. There are a few zombies like the Haunted Dead, like I mentioned, which is the 4 mana, 3 and a black 2/2 that comes in with a 1/1 spirit, and then you can discard 2 cards and pay 1 and a black to return the Haunted Dead from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Advanced Stitchwing is another example of this. 3 blue for a 3/4 flyer at uncommon. 2 and a blue, discard 2 cards, return to your the graveyard, return it to the battlefield from the graveyard tapped. So, if you've got these kind of cards and you care a little bit about zombies, you can also include some Madness cards because these are decent Madness outlets. Past that, there's like 1 or 2 payoffs for actually being a zombie. We have Graph Harvest, which is a single black mana for an enchantment at uncommon. It says zombies you control have Menace and has an activated ability 3 and a black. Exile a creature card from your graveyard. You make a 2/2 black zombie token. Card's okay. It's not fantastic. Giving Menace is kind of nice. 5 mana to make a zombie is pretty slow. I think generally when you find yourself in this deck, it's either going to be because, blue and black are just pretty open, or you start with some rares, or you get past some zombie rares. I do think that the zombie payoff rares are pretty good. So something to keep your eye out for, but I imagine this is going to be one of the lesser tribal decks. I think this is out of the 5 tribal decks, I think this is the one that you're going to find yourself in the least, just because there's not a lot of reason to be in this deck. Okay, so those are the 5 allied tribal decks. Now we get to the enemy color decks, and they're all kind of doing their own thing here. Blue-red, in classic blue-red fashion, is blue-red spells. And this is actually where it all began in Innistrad. For those who've been playing the past few years, blue-red spells is just like, you see this every set. But we didn't see blue-red spells every set back in the day. Original Innistrad definitely had that theme, and Shadows Over Innistrad, I think, was even like the second time that we had a full-on spells matters. There's a lot of cards that care about spells. Prowess was a thing in some previous sets, but it wasn't like, all in spells. It was more just like, you're kind of a tempo deck. And this is all in spells. Like, this is, I actually remember specifically there was an episode of Limited Resources where Luis was talking about how to draft this deck, and Marshall asked something along the lines of like, okay, how many creatures are you running? Because, you can't run too few creatures. Like, this is limited after all. And Luis was like, no, I don't really think there's a limit. Like, I can play 6 creatures. And Marshall was like, whoa, what? That's crazy. And like, these days we see that pretty often because the spells decks are pretty supported. But it wasn't really novel concept back in the day. And the uncommon here, now we're getting to all the enemy color pairs, or at least most of them do actually have gold cards. The uncommon here is Mercurial Geist. So this is 2 blue-red for a 1/3 flyer at uncommon. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, the Geist gets +3/+0 until end of turn. So a really, really big buff for any spell you cast. It's really, this is a card that does not block very well the turn it comes down, but it puts out so much damage when you untap with it. Like, casting 2 spells, you're attacking for 7. There's spells that give trample, there's spells that give double strike. Sometimes you're just like, attacking them for 4 every turn, but sometimes you just like straight up kill them. Like there is a combo I want to note here. And it plays very well with Mercurial Geist, but also just plays well with a lot of creatures. Just like any creature really. Rush of Adrenaline plus Uncaged Fury. So Rush of Adrenaline is a common. Single red mana for an instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 until end of turn and gains trample. So a fine combat trick. And then Uncaged Fury, which is 2 and a red for an instant at uncommon. Target creature gets +1/+1 and gains double strike until end of turn. So anytime you have a trample trick and a double strike trick in the same set, definitely something to keep note of. And especially with Mercurial Geist. Like you cast, just think of this combo, right? You play Geist. You play Rush of Adrenaline. So it gets the +2 from the Rush and +3 from its own ability. So you've got a 6-power creature. Then you cast Uncaged Fury. Gives another +3, so that's 9. +1 from the Uncaged Fury. And then it gains double strike. So now you are dealing 20 damage worth of double strike trample damage. So definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. Like I said, it doesn't need to be paired with Mercurial Geist. It's just very, very over the top when you do. It kills them very, very quickly. It is a very classic spells deck. You're going to be looking for these cards that have prowess, care about when you're casting instances or sorceries. Thermal Alchemist is back, 1 and a red for an 0/3 defender at uncommon this time. It was a common last time. It was an uncommon in Midnight Hand too. So this is the 2 mana 0/3 defender. Tap it, deal a damage to each opponent. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you untap Thermal Alchemist. Such a beating. This card's excellent. Another one too, Ingenious Gob. And this is one that is a lot better than it might look. So this is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 common with prowess. Blue, Ingenious Gob gets +1, -1 until end of turn. So with any spell, and this is very much a threat of activation card, right? Your opponent attacks with this on turn 3. Most of the time, your opponent doesn't have a 4-powered creature they can block with. So, they have a 3/3, you attack with a Scob. Either you have the trick and you really get them, right? Or just any spell and you really get them because it's going to become a 3/4. Or if you don't have the trick and they call and you're just bluffing the trick, well, you can just pump the Scob and it's going to be a 3/2. So, really nice card. Responsible for a lot of damage, a lot of threat of activation damage where your opponent just can't block this early. Another card that plays pretty well with the Rush of Adrenaline, Uncaged Fury combo. When you have multiples of these, it's really a nightmare. They just like push out a ton of damage. Often the play pattern with these are just like, you play it, and if you're going to cast a spell that turn, you play it during combat. If you have additional mana lying around, you get to pump it. So often these attack for 5 damage, quite a bit. So definitely one of the key commons for this deck. And then Pyre Hound. This is kind of an interesting one. So 3 and a red for a 2/3 trample. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you put a +1/+1 counter on Pyre Hound. I think this is generally just a worse version of Ingenious Gab because it's a mana more. It's slower to get going. Yes, the damage sticks around, or the counters stick around rather than just being prowess. But I do think that single mana that is 1 more expensive, that is a pretty notable difference. And just like the Mercurial Geist, this thing doesn't block very well the turn it comes down, so you're really hoping to untap with it. And even when you untap with this, the output of damage isn't as bombastic as Mercurial Geist. Like, you cast a spell, it's a 3/4 trample. All right, maybe you cast 2, and you untap it, it's a 4/5 trample. Okay, that's pretty good, and definitely threatens to get out of hand. But it's not a card I would play like as many copies as I could get, where I would play as many copies as I could get of Thermal Alchemist or Ingenious Scab. Something to note too, that, spells is the main name of the game here, but the Werewolves and Madness play pretty well here. The Werewolf cards play well because you're playing with a lot of instants, so you can pretty freely play your Werewolf, pass the turn, flip it, play something as an instant. And the Madness cards, you got some good spells. Again, if you've got kind of an instant package, maybe you got some discard outlets, Alchemist Greeting, which is the 4 mana Madness removal spell, like that plays pretty well. You got a nice instant speed removal spell. So just something to note that, and this is true for a lot of the archetypes, you're not necessarily going to be like all in humans or all in spirits. You're definitely going to be reaching out to some of the other mechanics. There's pretty simple crossover, a pretty seamless crossover. It's not like Phyrexia where if you're blue-red, you really don't want the cards that the black deck wants. Or, you're black-white toxic, like, you just don't want anything that doesn't say toxic on it, right? It's not that, it's a lot more liberal with the cards you can put in your deck. There's a lot more cards that go in multiple decks and play nicely there. And then also, some cards to call out here. Rise from the Tide. So, the blue-red deck that I've been talking about, it's kind of been more of a tempo blue-red deck. You're just killing them, you're dealing damage. But blue-red also plays out as a pretty good controlling deck. So, Rise from the Tides is the main reason to be controlling. This is 5 and a blue for a sorcery at uncommon. create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. So, you play a control game, you cast some removal spells, you cast some card draw, your grave fills out with like 8 spells, you cast this, you win the game with 16 zombies, right? Or 16 power worth of zombies. Not that hard to enable this. You do want to have like a 10 creature, 9 creature deck, as many spells as you can. Almost, a good analog to this is probably Serpentine Curve from Strixhaven, where if you're building a Serpentine Curve deck, you just wanted as many spells as you can, as few creatures as you could, as many removal spells as you could. It's kind of the same thing, where you just play that control game, you cast your payoff, you win the game in short order after that. Blue-Green Investigate is another pretty nice one. This is one that I drafted a ton back in the day. So the signpost uncommon here is Ongoing Investigation. This is 1 in a blue for an uncommon enchantment. Whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you investigate. And it's got an ability, 1 in a green. Exile a creature card from your graveyard. Investigate, you gain 2 life. Card's awesome. Card's great. It's really runs away with the game if you have any good offense, if you have any evasion. Even just like puts your opponent in a spot where they have to block. And then when they do block, your creatures trade off. They go to the graveyard. You can exile some stuff from your graveyard, gain some life, draw some cards. Gaining life plays really nice with the clues, because when you're using mana to crack clues, you're not affecting the board, so getting some life back is really, really nice. There are, like I said, a few cards that call out clues, Graph Mole being one of the more important ones. So 2 and a green for a 2/4 at uncommon. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you gain 3 life. Again, same thing going on here, where you're cracking clues, you're spending mana. 3 life on all those means that you're not going to get burned out. If you've taken some early damage, you can recoup some of those losses. Erdwall Illuminator is another pretty good one. It's the 2 mana 1/3 flyer uncommon. Whenever you investigate for the first time each turn, you investigate an additional time. And a Bloodbriar. So this is 2 and a green for a 2/3 at common. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, you put a counter on Bloodbriar. +1/+1 counter. And so, every time you crack a clue, this gets bigger. This also, of course, works for any black sacrifice things that you have, any white sacrifice things you have. So is a mostly blue-green card, but does play other places as well. All right, and then Black-Green Delirium. So I did touch on this as a mechanic, as I was talking about the mechanics, but Black-Green is generally just going to be a slower, grindier deck where you're playing early defense, you're playing your early cards, you're just blocking early, your cards turn on later, right? You've got stuff like Gnarlworld Dryad, which is a single green mana for a 1/1 Death Touch that, if you have Delirium, turns into a 3/3. That's a nice little downshift. That was an uncommon before. That's just one of the better cards, actually, a common. One of the green commons that I think is great if you can turbo it out and get a 3/3 Death Touch, because that's a pain. But also just good as, 1/1 Death Touch is generally a fine card, and then eventually turns on. The gold uncommon is kind of out of place. It's kind of weird. Morn Willow. This is 1 black-green for a 3/2 haste as Delirium. If there are 4 more card types in your graveyard, then when it enters the battlefield, the creatures with 2 or less power can't block this turn. So kind of a weird aggressive card in a more grindy deck. A little bit out of place, was never like a high pick back in the day. So way more of a reward than a reason to get into black-green. And just some notes on black-green in general. There's only 3 cards at common with Delirium. That Gnarlworld Dryad that I mentioned, the 1/1 Death Touch that turns into a 3/3. There's the Obsessive Skinner, which is the 1 in a green 1/1 that ETBs puts a +1/+1 counter on something, and then if you have Delirium, it puts something, every upkeep you can put a counter on something. And then also Thraben Foulbloods, which is a 2 and a black 3/2 that if you have Delirium, it gets +1/+1 in Menace. So not a ton of payouts at common. There is a really good payoff at uncommon, Kindly Stranger. This is 1 in a black for a 2/3. Delirium, 2 in a black, activate it only if you have Delirium. When it flips into a 4/3 that destroys target creature. The thing about these Delirium cards is they do play pretty well in most decks. Like I mentioned, like most games are going to get to the point where you've got 4 card types in your graveyard. This black-green deck turbos the Delirium out quicker than other decks, but everybody's going to want a Kindly Stranger if they're playing black, right? It's not like you get this card, it's like, oh, cool, this is my reward for Delirium. People are just going to take this card. So I'm a little bit hesitant about Black-Green Delirium as a deck in itself, because there's not a ton of payoffs, and the payoffs that do exist, other people can snap them up pretty freely as well. Black-White. So Black-White is, the uncommon here is Anguished Unmaking, which is just a removal spell. It was downshifted from rare. 1 black-white for an instant. Exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life, which is a solid removal spell. Losing 3 life is definitely something to note. Losing 3 life in this set is not as painful as losing 3 life in like Brothers War or Phyrexia. It's not quite as fast, but it still does matter. It used to have this kind of like aura sub-theme, buying auras back from the graveyard, mainly off the back of Ironclad Slayer, which is still in the set, but they strangely upshifted to uncommon. This is 2 and a white for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can return an aura or equipment card from your graveyard to your hand. The thing you want to do with this is buy back Deadweight, which is the single black aura that gives something -2, -2. Back in the day, there was Boon of Emrakul, which was a 3 mana aura that gave something +3, -3. That was a nice combo, but you're not going to get that very often. I imagine Ironclad Slayer is not going to be a card that most people want, so this is going to be a card that you can pick up pretty late, I assume. And so if you've got that going on, it's a thing, but the problem here with black and white is the white cards are aggressive, the black cards are mainly controlling. So you don't have a lot of implicit synergy. The cards kind of don't play that well together. I would imagine most of the time you end up in this deck, you're just going to be like, I've got some good white cards, some good black cards. These are clearly the colors that were open. It's not going to be a deck you're going to draft. Like, if you draft this set 5 times, I think it's very unlikely you end up in white-black. There's just not that many reasons. And then the last deck here, red-white aggro. Not that complex of a deck, but deceptively bad. So most sets have just like a red-white aggro deck that just works. Like, you know, the white aggressive cards are good, the red aggressive cards are good. Doesn't need much synergy, you just throw them in. But in this set, the white aggro decks operate in a certain way, and the red ones operate in a certain way, and they don't really mix. Like, the white aggro decks are all about humans, for the most part. That's like their main synergy concession. And the red aggro decks are about madness. That's their main synergy concession. And there's no, or very few, ways to enable madness in white, and there are very few humans in red. So you don't get a lot of natural crossover. The gold uncommon Ride Down, which is 1 in red for an instant, destroy target blocking creature. Creatures blocked by that creature this turn gain trample until end of turn. So the way this pans out is you attack with your 4/4, they block, you destroy the block creature, your thing gains trample. Basically, it's as if your creature was not blocked. So nice, good removal spell, but I don't think it really makes up for the fact that there's so little synergy between these cards. Like, if you could just put together some aggro cards that don't care about madness and don't care about humans, then that's a thing. Also, you could just have like a base red madness deck with a few white cards, or a base human white deck with a few red cards. That can certainly work, but just noting that there is a distinct lack of synergy between these colors. Okay, so those are the archetypes. Before we pack up, 2 last things. I want to touch on some top commons, and I want to touch on the Shadows of the Past cards, that bonus sheet. So the Shadows of the Past cards is where we're going to start here. The weird thing, like I mentioned at the top of the show, is it's not like Brothers War or Strixhaven, where the bonus sheet, the card in each pack, is going to be pulled from like 40 cards, and it could just be like any of those cards. Every week you draft this set, there's a rotating list that will go into effect every week. So the first week, all the cards care about, oh, I should also say, and each week there's a theme for these cards. And each week there's about 18 cards that you could see. So the first week is called Creature Type Terror. So you're going to have a lot of cards that care about certain creature types. The main 5 creature types: humans, vampires, werewolves, zombies, and you know, that kind of stuff, spirits. Cards that support that. The second week is called Fatal Flashback. So it's a bunch of flashback cards. The third week is called Morbid and Macabre, which is all a bunch of sacrifice cards, cards that care about death. And then the last week is called Abominable All-Stars, which is like filled with the most iconic cards from Innistrad. So you got your Gristlebrand's, your Avacyn's, your Snapcasters, your Geist of St. Traps, all those kind of cards. Today, I'm going to go over all of the cards from the first week from Creature Type Terror. I'm going to be covering all the cards at some point in a future episode. I haven't exactly decided how I'm going to go about it. I think what I'm going to do is every week that this, you know, the card sheet kind of rotates, I'm going to have either a small video or a small podcast episode, like a 10-15 minute long one, just talking about each of the cards, because I know most people will not have played with these cards. Also, most people will not have that much time to get a handle for all these cards. Also, since they're only out for a week, 17 lands data on these cards is going to be a little bit less available. So I did want to cover them all in their entirety. I won't have time to talk about all of them today, but like I said, I will be covering that first week. And I do think that these cards are going to have a pretty major impact on the format. More so than Strixhaven, and definitely more so than Brothers War, because unlike those sets, this list is mostly curated for the draft format, I would say. Like, sure, there's some concessions that we want this in constructed. We want to see this card in historic. We want to give Pioneer or Explorer players access to these cards. But most of them, they didn't have to balance, oh, what do commander cards, or what do commander players want? What do people collecting cards want? They just said, what will make the limited format more interesting? And that means that more of the cards are relevant. So, if you're drafting Brothers War, maybe you'd get a card that mattered, or maybe you'd get a bone saw, right? Like a niche card that went in like your deck 1 out of 40 times you drafted the set. Most of the cards on these lists are pretty good. And something to consider is the value of the other cards in the set is going to change week to week, right? So week 1, where you're going to be drafting all these cards that care about creature types, the tribal cards, you're going to be more likely to draft an allied color pair than an enemy color pair week 1, because you get all these payoffs, where week 2, Fatal Flashback, well, I imagine blue-red spells is going to get a lot better because you got all these flashback spells. So just something to consider, that I do think the draft form is going to feel not leagues different week to week, but notably different week to week. You should definitely pay attention to the cards on the bonus sheet. If you're looking for the full list, they have posted this on the Wizards website. Very difficult to find in classic Wizards fashion. It's hidden. I will post that in the show notes and the description down below if you want to check that out. But without further ado, let's get into the cards of week 1. So I've organized these kind of in a tier list: the bombs, the good rares, the good uncommons, the good commons. Like I mentioned before, they span all rarities. There's mythics, rares, uncommons, commons. The first 2 cards I want to point out here, the bomb cards, are Bloodline Keeper and Mayor of Averbuck. These are just excellent. Some of the best cards in their original set. I believe Bloodline Keeper, there was a good argument for this being the best card in original Innistrad. So for Bloodline Keeper here, we've got 2 black for a 3/3 flyer at Mythic. Tap, create a 2/2 black vampire creature token with flying. And it's got an ability, black, transform Bloodline Keeper. Activate this ability only if you control 5 or more vampires. Okay, so 3/3 flyer that taps to make flyers every turn. That's very, very good. And the backside is a 5/5 flyer. Other vampires you control get +2/+2. And then it's got the same ability as the front side. Tap, put a 2/2 black vampire creature with flying on the battlefield. And of course, those are 4/4 flyers as long as the vampire, the Bloodline Keeper, is on the battlefield. So, awesome, excellent card. Mayor of Averbuck is another awesome one. 1 green for a 1/1 rare. It's a werewolf. Other humans you control get +1/+1. And then it's got the werewolf text. If no spells have been cast, you flip it. The backside is a werewolf. It's a 3/3. Other werewolves and wolves, you get control +1/+1. And at the beginning of your end step, you put a 2/2 green wolf token on the battlefield. So both of these are kind of like armies in a can. They're excellent. You're going to want to first pick these and build around them. Just fantastic cards. You don't even really need to build around them, right? Like Bloodline Keeper in a black-green deck, it's still going to be excellent. You don't need other vampires. Mayor of Averbuck, it gets better with werewolves and wolves, but it's just an army in a can in itself. It's going to produce 3/3 wolves. Just a fantastic card. The next tier here, we have good rares. So not quite as busted, but good rares. First one here is Angel of Flight Alabaster. This is 5 and a white for a 4/4 flyer. At the beginning of your upkeep, return a spirit from your graveyard to your hand. So, a good spirit payoff. Havengul Runebinder, 2 blue for a 2/2 at rare. It's a wizard, human wizard. It's got the ability 2 and a blue, tap it. Exile a creature card from your graveyard, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each zombie you control. So a zombie payoff. It's a little bit slow to get going, but if you can untap with this, you make a 3/3, and then you make a 4/4, and it just, or that 3/3 becomes a 4/4, and you make another 3/3, and this does take over. Not as good as the other 2 cards, the Army in a Can, the Bloodline Keeper, and Mayor of Averbuck, because you have to keep pumping mana into this, but still a strong card. And Crew and Outlaw. So this is 1 red for a 2/2 first strike. It's a werewolf. The backside is a 3/3 double strike that all your werewolves have menace. So pretty solid rare. We also got uncommon tribal lords, and these cards are almost rare level power. So there's one for each of the creature types except humans. Humans get their own thing that I'm going to get to in a second. These are all 3 mana lords, and they cost, for example, the zombie one costs 1 blue-black, the spirit one costs 1 blue-white. They're all first pickable. I think you should take these, build around them. Like, they are strong incentives to get into this color pair. Diregraph Captain is the zombie one. 3 mana, 1 black, blue for a 2/2 Death Touch at uncommon. Other zombies you control get +1/+1, and whenever another zombie you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life. Drogskull Captain, 1 blue white for a 2/2 flyer. Other spirits you control get +1/+1 and have hexproof. So the thing with this card, and it's not going to come too often because it's an uncommon on the bonus sheet, but if you have 2 of them in play, they give each other hexproof. So you're going to have 2 3/3 flying hexproof creatures, and that's pretty hard to beat if you're at all at parity or if you're close to, if you're not just super far behind, that's going to win the game a lot of the time. Stormkirk Captain, this is 1 black-red for a 2/2 first strike. Other vampires you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. And Immerwolf, 1 red-green for a 2/2. It's got Intimidate, which is a weird old ability that you might not be used to, but basically Intimidate is, this can't be blocked by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it. So basically, this can only be blocked by red or green creatures or artifact creatures. It also says other wolves and werewolves you control get +1/+1. It also has another ability, non-human werewolves you control can't transform. So as long as Immerwolf's on the battlefield, your werewolves, when they flip to the backside, they can't flip back, even if your opponent casts multiple spells. So all 4 of these, awesome. Humans don't get a human lord, but they get pretty similar level, power level cards, I would say, in 2 equipment. They get Butcher's Cleaver, which is a 3 mana equipment that is equip 3 at uncommon. The equipped creature gets +3/+0, and as long as the equipped creature is a human, it has lifelink. So that's just a really nice piece of equipment. And Abyssin's Caller, another pretty nice one. Single colorless mana. The equipped creature has +1/+0 in vigilance, and then whenever the equipped creature dies, if it was a human, you put a 1/1 flying spirit token onto the battlefield. So again, about the similar power level as those other cards, good build arounds. I probably wouldn't put these cards in decks without humans. They're just like not really good enough. You do want these to be human cards, but if you had to, it's not the worst. And then the next tier down, we've got 5 tribal support cards. These aren't bombs by any means, but they're probably better than your average common compared to the rest of the cards in the set. So you've got Elder Cathar as the human one. This is 2 and a white for a 2/2. Whenever it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If that creature you control is a human, you instead put 2 counters on it. Vampiric Fury is an instant, 1 in a red. Vampire creatures you control get +2/+0 and gained first strike until end of turn. So you really have to be heavy vampires to want this card, or else it doesn't do anything. But it is a really strong trick if you've got multiple vampires. Ghoul Raiser, strong card as well. 1 black for a 2/2. When Ghoul Raiser enters the battlefield, return a zombie card at random from your graveyard to your hand. Battleground Geist, 5 mana, 4 and a blue for a 3/3 flyer. Other spirits you control get +0/+1. And Moon Mist, 1 in a green, this is the werewolf one. Instant, transform all humans. Prevent all combat damage that be dealt by creatures other than werewolves and wolves. So not only do you get the backside, so your creatures get much bigger, the backside of your werewolves, but also they're going to win combat a lot of the time because your opponent's creatures aren't going to deal damage. So all these are strong, not like, by no means are they bomb level, but above your average common, I would say. At the same time, though, like, that's with the caveat that your deck has a reasonable number of cards of this creature type. Like, all of these cards, I would say that if you've got some in the neighborhood of, like, 8 of that creature type, they're going to pull their weight. Anything below that, they might be a little bit lackluster, right? Because, like, you read these cards and you take off the tribal part, well, Elder Cathar is just a 2/2 that dies and puts a counter on something. That's not that good. Ghoul Raiser is just a 2/2, right? So, just keep in mind that they're good payoffs, but you do have to build around them. You have to make some concessions to them. And then the last 2 cards, kind of weirdly thrown in here. I'm not sure why. They don't really fit in with the creature type matter stuff. So we've got Traveler's Amulet, which is a single mana for an artifact. You can sacrifice it for a single mana, go get a land from your deck, put it into your hand, just a fixing tool. And Haunted Fengraf, which is a land, colorless land, taps, add colorless. 3 tap it, sacrifice it. Sacrifice Haunted Fengraf, return a creature at random from your graveyard to your hand. Find colorless land if you have the room for it. If your mana requirements aren't that tough, maybe as an 18th land, gets back a creature card. Nothing exciting though, nothing too special. All right, and then to close out here, I do of course want to touch on some top commons because I think it's important information going into the first week. So I don't have an order for these, just notable commons in each color. I'm just gonna call them out here. There's some of these colors that I do feel more strongly than others, what the top common is, but some of them I'm just gonna be like, yeah, these are some pretty good cards. Keep your eye out for them when you're drafting. So for white, Thraben Inspector. This is probably gonna be the best common, I imagine. Best white common. Close with Bound with Moonsilver, which is a great removal spell. So Thraben Inspector, this is one I've brought up a bunch, but this is a single white mana for a 1/2. It investigates when it enters the battlefield. It seems kind of like, not that exciting, but it's essentially a 1 mana 1/2 for no cards, right? Just, you have to pay some mana into it. So if you want to think about it, it's a 3 mana 1/2, but the installment plan really matters there. And the thing is, with clues, some of their value, of course, is sacrificing them to draw a card, but they also give you a permanent for stuff like Angelic Purge, which is another white common here. 3 mana, 2 and a white, sorcery, sacrifice a additional permanent, as well, sacrifice an additional permanent when you cast a spell, exile target creature, enchantment, or artifact. So that's kind of a nice little combo there. Bound by Moonsilver, the card I mentioned a second ago, really nice pacifism variant. 2 and a white for a aura at common. Enchanted creature can't attack, block, or transform. And it says sacrifice another permanent. Attach Bound by Moonsilver to target creature. Activate only as a sorcery and only once per turn. I'm not sure why you'd want to do it multiple times a turn, but it's there. So basically, you put it on their thing early. You know, that thing is not a threat as the game goes on. You move it to the next best thing as the game goes on. You sacrifice land, you sacrifice a clue, sacrifice whatever. Usually whatever you sacrifice, you know, it's going to be worth it to move it over to their 5/5 flyer or whatever it is. Dauntless Cathar, another good one. Mentioned this one before. 2 and a white for a 3/2. Exile from your graveyard by paying 1 and a white. And you make a 1/1 spirit token. Just a really solid attacker, really solid blocker. And Sigardian Priest. 1 and a white for a 1/2. Tap, pay 1. Tap target non-human creature. Definitely can be awkward in like the human mirrors, but is very, very good against any zombie vampire deck. Like it's just a 2 mana 1 to activate tapper. That's really efficient. Next up is blue. So blue's got a few notable cards here. So first one here is Drag Under. This is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Draw a card. You know, we've seen variants of this. Tolarian Geyser. The blue Skull Bomb from Phyrexia. So it's not as good as Tolarian Geyser, of course. You can't kick it to gain life, but it's a solid card. Ingenious Scab. This is the 2 and a blue, 2/3 prowess that you can pump for a blue mana to give +1, -1, like I mentioned. Jace's Scrutiny. This is a card that took a long time for people to catch on for. So it is 1 and a blue for an instant. Target creature gets -4, -0 until end of turn, and you investigate. So you win a combat a lot of the time, and you draw a card at a later date, right? We know these cards are pretty good, and you know, we're used to the kind of card advantage generating combat tricks in Suit Up, and cards like Arcane Subtraction. If you think of Strixhaven, it's a pretty similar comparison. Obviously, it's not as good as Suit Up or Majestic Metamorphosis, because you can't make your creature gigantic. This only wins a combat if your creature was going to trade anyways, but it is still pretty solid. You also don't mind sometimes just your opponent goes for a big attack, you make one of their things smaller, they dealt way less damage than they thought they were going to, you eat something, maybe they had an attack where it's like, okay, I'm going to attack, one of my creatures is going to get eaten, but I'm going to get through 9 damage, and then Jace's Scrutiny makes their 4-power creature smaller, makes that attack not that good for them. So definitely a solid card if you have enough creatures in your deck where you can get into combat often enough. Drownyard Explorers, another pretty solid card. 3 and a blue for a 2/4. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, which is really funny because this is a fine card. You know, just a totally serviceable card. It's not amazing, but it's also just, I give it a solid C to give it a letter grade. But if you compare it to Thraben Inspector, you're basically paying 3 mana for a +1/+3 aura, and that just like points to how good Thraben Inspector is, right? Because this card is, you know, fine, totally serviceable, you'll put it in your deck, but Thraben Inspector is also very, very good and costs 3 mana less for almost, you know, a very, very similar card. Last blue common here is Geist of the Archive. This is 2 and a blue for a 0/4 Defender. At the beginning of your upkeep, you scry 1. This is a downshift. This wasn't uncommon. Deceptively good. Looks kind of mopey, looks kind of whatever, but 0/4 blocks a lot of stuff, and just sitting there, scrying every upkeep is really, really nice. Just, you know, for no mana, you just get to fix your draws every turn. Really, really nice blocker. Good in any deck that wants to block. Moving on to black here. Black has a sort of a lack of good commons. One thing to note about black is the removal spells are actually pretty bad. You get Deadweight, which is a single black mana for the aura, gives something -2, -2. It also gets a 6 mana removal spell. It's like 6 mana, destroy target creature. You gain 2 life, your opponent loses 2 life. It's not unplayable. Like, you put that card into Phyrexia All Be One or Brothers War or any recent set that was fast. That would not be a card that would ever make your deck. It's not a great card, but the set is slow-ish enough that you can main one and not feel terrible about it. But at the same time, there's no, like, 5 mana catch-all removal spell. Uncommon, there's no even, like, murder variant at uncommon. So usually we look to black as like, okay, well, maybe its creatures aren't amazing, but its removal is good. You actually don't even get that here. So I think that black is probably the worst color. It was the worst color in Eldritch Moon and the second worst in Shadows Over Innistrad. And aside from the bone that they threw us with black with Giss's Bidding, which is the token maker that they shifted down from uncommon to common, the Madness token maker, they didn't do black many favors, honestly. They didn't really bump things from rare to uncommon or uncommon to common. Some other cards of note, Olivia's Dragoons, which is the 2-drop Madness Enabler, discard a card, give it flying, and Crow of Dark Tidings is the 3-mana 2/1 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards, also mills 2 cards when it dies. So solid enablers for the decks they go in. Crow is obviously for Delirium, Olivia's Dragoons for Madness, but no like gigantic standout common aside from Giss's Bidding and Deadweight. Red, on the other hand, has quite a few good commons. So it's got a suite of 3 good removal spells. Incendiary Flow, which is 2 mana sorcery. Incendiary Flow deals 3 damage to any target, including players. If a creature would be dealt damage this way, you exile it instead. Galvanic Bombardment, instant. Galvanic Bombardment deals X damage to target creature, where X is 2 plus the number of cards named Galvanic Bombardment in your graveyard. So kind of a collect them all kind of card where it's just a shock the first time you cast it, but eventually gets to 3 damage, 4 damage, 5 damage. Really nice card. And Alchemist Greeting, which is the 4 damage Madness removal spell I talked about. It's also got a pair of pretty good 2-drops. Deranged Whelp, 2 mana, 2/1 Menace, and the Bloodseeker, Ravenous Bloodseeker, 1 red for a 1/3. Discard a card, Bloodseeker, it's +2, -2 until end of turn. So again, that Madness enabler. So red's got a host of good commons, a lot of good interaction spells, and there's also a few I didn't even mention here. These are just the top 5, but red's got some pretty good stuff going on. And then moving to green, we've got Byway Courier, which is the 3 mana 3/2 that dies and investigates. Obsessive Skinner, which is the Delirium payoff that puts a counter on something, and then if you have Delirium, puts more counters on things. Rabid Bite, which is a sorcery speed bite spell, 1 in a green. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to another creature you don't control. And Gnarlwood Dryad, the single green mana for a 1/1 Death Touch at common, gets +2/+2 as long as you have Delirium. So solid cards. All these are just, cards I'm pretty happy to put in my deck. No gigantic standouts, but unlike black, I don't feel bad about the green cards. Basically, I don't feel like I'm struggling for playables. I think that most of the green cards are at least solid on their own. And that's it. Thank you everybody for watching, listening. I am of course going to send this to Twitch chat for any questions you might have. So Twitch chat, send them to me. Happy to answer anything. And this is a lot of information for just the overview. Like I noted, this is a overview where I have some past information informing me here. So I'm covering more stuff than I usually would, but hopefully I didn't blaze through things too quickly, and there was enough being able to be absorbed. But if not, of course, as always, if you want me to cover anything that I touched on a little more in depth, happy to do so. So Twitch chat, send them to me. All right, first question. Hey Alex, a lot of content I see around this set is coming out of the appeal for the nostalgia of players who played the original sets. Do you think this set offers a generally good format for newer players who have only played in the past few years? Yes, definitely. I think this format's great. I can't specifically speak to this version of it, but I really, really liked Eldritch Moon, and Shadows Over Innistrad was like a fine set. Wasn't in my top 10 or whatever, but was a good set. Eldritch Moon, mind you, is in my top 10. I do think that set is awesome. And I do think, like I said, they brought a lot of the good things about each set, and they took out a lot of the maybe not so great things. So this is a good format, especially if you're somebody who wants a little more breathing room. Or I should say, I project that this will be a good format. I don't have any surefire answers right now. Ask me in a few days, of course, when the set comes out. But I do think that there's, if you are a player who's never played the set before, it's going to be a cool experience. It's not like an ancient set where your baselines are going to be totally off. Like I mentioned, like 3 mana 2/2 flyer is still not amazing. It's still just like whatever. So most of the cards, when you look at them, they are going to, as you read them, they're going to be about as good as you think they are. I would assume if you're using your modern card evaluation skills, modern sensibilities. I would recommend this to people even if they've never played it before. It's also not that complex of a set. Like the synergies and the like what you're supposed to do are pretty spelled out, and there's not a ton of traps or anything. It's not like, oh, this is really the thing you're supposed to do with green white, even though it's a human deck, right? It's not like, it's pretty new player friendly, I would say. And also it's a little bit slower than a lot of sets of recent, a lot of the recent sets. So if you're looking for something maybe more akin to Strixhaven, I think Strixhaven's pretty a good example for speed, or a good analog. Now, I think this set might have sped up a little bit with the some of the downshifts from uncommon to common, especially with the Black-Red Madness deck being really good this go around, or at least that's what I think it's going to be. But I also think that it's going to be nowhere near as fast as something like Brothers War or Phyrexia. So yes, it gets my seal of approval. All right, next question. Do you think that 17 lands will be unreliable this set as archetypes get better and worse from week to week? Yeah, that's a pretty good question. I would say that you can use 17 lands as a baseline, just like you can in any other set, but you might find some cards that their game in hand win rate is not as representative of their actual value in your deck compared to some other set. It's a little bit less reliable to draft by the numbers, I would say. So yes, I think that less reliable than a normal set that doesn't have some sort of weird rotating card list, but also still valuable. I wouldn't discount it. I wouldn't dismiss it, just discount it a little bit. Doesn't more flash cards in the set mean that werewolves get better? Basically, you force your opponent to play at sorcery speed if they don't want your werewolves to flip. I think it cuts both ways, right? Like, it means that you are going to have your opponents having things that they can cast at instant speed more often, but it also means you will as well. So maybe it balances out your thought about forcing your opponent to play instant speed. No, it doesn't, right? Because your opponent, if they have flash cards, they get to disrupt your werewolves, right? Because in this set, it's not just, doesn't care about just your stuff on your turn if you cast something. It cares about your opponent casting something too, right? So if they've got access to the madness cards that they can flash in, well, that means that your werewolves are going to flip a little bit less often. So I would say on average, it hurts the werewolves more than it helps them to have just a bunch of flash cards in the set. But game to game, you will have it kind of feel like it cuts both ways. All right, I'm going to pack it up from there. Thank you so much, chat, for being here, asking some questions. And like I mentioned, I will be doing another episode in the coming week, a state of the format address once we have the cards in our hands or in our digital hands at our fingertips. And yeah, just like any other format, we're going to be covering this one to some lengths. So thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.